The city was glowing that evening, lights dancing across the tall glass buildings. Cars moved like tiny ants below, rushing in every direction, carrying people who were tired, hopeful, or simply trying to make it home after a long day. But on the top floor of one of those shiny towers sat a man who, from the outside, seemed to have it all. His name was Daniel Carter. A billionaire, a businessman who had built his empire from the ground up, admired by newspapers, feared by competitors, and envied by countless strangers. To the world, Daniel was the picture of success. His name was on magazine covers, his speeches filled with confidence, and his lifestyle seemed like a dream many could only imagine. Private jets, exclusive parties, designer suits, and the power to make decisions that shaped entire industries, this was his everyday reality. People bowed their heads when he entered a room. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, and investors listened carefully to every word he spoke. But behind that polished smile, behind the custom-made suits and the grand offices, there was a man who carried a heavy weight. What most people didn't see, and what he never let anyone know, was that Daniel often felt painfully alone. It wasn't that he didn't have people around him, he had plenty. Assistants, secretaries, lawyers, and business partners. His phone buzzed every few minutes with someone trying to get his attention. Yet, for all the noise in his life, there was a quiet emptiness that echoed louder than anything else. He missed the days when conversations felt simple, when people talked to him because they cared, not because they wanted something. Now, nearly every interaction had a price tag. If someone smiled, he wondered, what do they want from me? If someone offered friendship, he thought, are they hoping for a business deal? Over time, he had built invisible walls around himself, walls to protect him from disappointment and betrayal. But those same walls also kept out love, kindness, and warmth. That evening, Daniel sat in his office after a meeting that had drained him more than usual. Investors had questioned his decisions, board members had doubted his ideas, and even though he had defended himself well, he felt worn out. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, and he leaned back in his leather chair staring at the city lights. To anyone passing by, he looked like a king surveying his kingdom. But in truth, he felt like a man sitting on top of a mountain with no one beside him. He thought about his childhood, growing up in a small neighborhood where life was much simpler. Back then, success wasn't about millions or billions, it was about having dinner together, laughing with friends, or playing outside until the street lights came on. His parents weren't rich, but they were present. They hugged him when he felt down, encouraged him when he failed, and celebrated even his smallest victories. Somewhere along the journey of chasing greatness, Daniel had lost those simple treasures. He rubbed his forehead and sighed. The weight of his empire pressed against him like a stone he couldn't put down. What's the point of all this, he thought, if at the end of the day, I still feel alone? It was a dangerous thought for someone like him, someone expected to always appear strong, confident, and untouchable. Showing weakness was not an option. Or so he believed. When the clock struck 10, Daniel finally decided to leave the office. His driver was waiting downstairs, but instead of calling him, Daniel chose to walk. He told his staff not to follow, not to worry. He wanted, just for a moment, to feel like a normal man walking through the city. No cameras, no board members, no deals. Just him and the night air. The streets were alive with people, street vendors selling food, couples holding hands, children laughing as they tugged on their parents' coats. Daniel walked quietly, unnoticed by most. For once, it felt good to be invisible, to just be another face in the crowd. But even as he walked, the loneliness clung to him. The laughter around him reminded him of what he lacked. The families made him think of the home he returned to, big, beautiful, but painfully empty. At one point, he stopped by a small park where children were still playing, their voices echoing with joy. He watched them for a while, remembering his own carefree days. Then, his eyes landed on a young woman sitting on a bench. She looked ordinary, simple clothes, a kind face, nothing extraordinary at first glance. But something about her presence caught his attention. She wasn't busy on her phone like most people. She wasn't rushing anywhere. She was just sitting there, observing the world with calm, gentle eyes. As Daniel walked past, their eyes met for a brief second. It wasn't the usual look he got from people, no recognition, no calculation, no curiosity about his wealth. It was simply human. Pure. She seemed to notice the heaviness in his face, the tiredness he tried so hard to hide. For a moment, Daniel felt exposed, as if she could see beyond the billionaire image and into the weary soul beneath. He looked away quickly and kept walking, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. Something about that encounter stirred him. It was as though a mirror had been placed before him, reflecting the truth he didn't want to admit, that despite all his riches, he longed for something money could never buy: genuine connection. By the time he reached the next streetlight, Daniel paused. He realized his steps had slowed, his heart beating differently than before. It was strange, just one look from a stranger had shaken him more than the questions from an entire boardroom of investors. He sighed again, deeply, the kind of sigh that comes when a man carries far too much on his shoulders. As the cool night air brushed his face, Daniel whispered to himself, though no one else could hear, maybe what I need isn't another deal, maybe it's something simpler. What he didn't know was that life was about to give him an answer. And it would come in the most unexpected form: just a few soft words and an embrace he never saw coming. Daniel kept walking through the city streets, but the image of that woman on the park bench stayed in his mind. Something about her calmness, the way she looked at him without judgment, had touched a corner of his heart he usually kept locked away. It was unusual for him to even notice strangers. Normally, his eyes stayed fixed on his phone, on contracts, on numbers, or he moved quickly through places so no one could stop him. But tonight felt different. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't pretending to be strong. He was just tired. And maybe because of that, her eyes had caught his attention. He tried to shake the thought off. She's just a stranger, he told himself. Why should it matter? But the truth was, her face had felt more real to him than the faces he saw in boardrooms every day. As he passed a small bakery that was closing for the night, Daniel slowed down. He watched the shop owner sweeping the floor while laughing with his young daughter. That laughter hit him like a soft echo of something he had lost. He wondered if anyone ever laughed like that around him anymore, not because they wanted to impress him, but because they were simply happy to be near him. The billionaire adjusted his coat and kept walking. The night was colder now, and he pulled the collar closer to his neck. The city seemed louder, but at the same time, inside his chest, there was a quiet space opening up, a space filled with longing he couldn't explain. Then it happened. Just a few steps ahead, he saw her again. The same young woman from the park bench. She was standing now, near a bus stop, holding a small paper bag, probably with something simple like bread or groceries. Daniel almost stopped in his tracks. He hadn't expected to see her twice. The city was big, running into the same person twice was rare. She noticed him too. Their eyes met again. This time, she didn't look away. She smiled softly, not the kind of smile people give when they recognize someone famous, but the kind of smile that says, I see you, I notice you as a human being. Daniel felt something shift inside him. It was uncomfortable at first. He wasn't used to being seen this way. He was used to people either staring too long because of who he was, or avoiding eye contact because they were intimidated. But this was different. As he got closer, he noticed that she had a warmth about her. No designer clothes, no luxury items, just a simple person standing in the night. And yet, her presence was stronger than all the attention he usually received. When he walked past her, he expected the moment to end. But instead, she tilted her head slightly and said in a gentle voice, "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" Daniel froze. For a second, he thought he had misheard her. No one had ever said something like that to him. Not in years. Not in this way. People asked him for business deals, for donations, for opportunities. But a hug. A stranger offering him something so simple, without wanting anything in return, it felt unreal. He turned his head slowly to look at her. Her eyes were steady, kind, and without any hidden agenda. She wasn't joking. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She had simply noticed the heaviness in his face, the loneliness in his posture, and spoke what she felt. Inside Daniel's chest, a battle began. His mind told him to keep walking. He was a billionaire, after all. What if someone saw him hugging a stranger on the street? What if a photographer was nearby? What if tomorrow's news headline was, "Billionaire seen hugging random woman in the city"? He imagined his board members raising their eyebrows, his assistants whispering. But his heart whispered something else. His heart said, "You need this. You haven't been held like this in years. You are always surrounded by people, but never touched with kindness." He didn't answer right away. Seconds passed, though they felt longer. The woman didn't push. She just waited patiently, her arms not even open yet, but her intention clear. She left the choice to him. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath. He looked around. No cameras, no reporters, just a quiet corner of the city. He let out a small sigh and said softly, "Okay." The woman smiled and stepped closer. Then, gently, she wrapped her arms around him. At first, Daniel stood stiff, unsure of how to respond. But as the hug lingered, something inside him began to melt. It was a simple embrace, not too long, not too short, but filled with sincerity. For the first time in so many years, he felt something he couldn't buy with all the money in the world: human warmth without expectation. His chest tightened, and he realized he had been holding back tears for far too long. He didn't cry, but his eyes grew moist. He closed them for a moment, letting the hug remind him that he was still human, still capable of being cared for, still worthy of love that wasn't tied to his bank account. When the woman stepped back, she didn't say anything more. She didn't ask who he was, didn't hand him a business card, didn't request a favor. She just smiled again, as if to say, "There. You needed that." Daniel looked at her, speechless. For a man who always had the right words in meetings, who always knew how to negotiate, he suddenly found himself unable to speak. All he could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." The woman nodded and turned slightly, waiting for her bus. She didn't chase him or linger. For her, it was just a moment of kindness, nothing more. But for Daniel, it was everything. He stood there for a while, watching her leave. His heart felt lighter, though he didn't fully understand why. One hug from a stranger had shaken something deep within him. It was as if a part of his soul, locked away for years, had been touched gently and reminded that it was still alive. As Daniel finally walked away, he kept replaying the words in his head, "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" Those words echoed more powerfully than the speeches he gave to thousands, more deeply than the praise he received from the media. They were simple, but they carried truth. Someone had seen his pain, and instead of ignoring it, they reached out. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, that small moment was about to change the way he saw his life forever. The hug had ended, but the feeling stayed with Daniel long after he stepped away from that bus stop. He walked slowly, his hands tucked in his coat pockets, his mind spinning with thoughts he could not easily explain. For years, he had faced life with strength, with control, with a kind of armor that never let anyone see inside. Yet in one single moment, a hug offered by a stranger, those walls felt cracked. It was strange. Daniel had attended countless events where people shook his hand firmly, slapped his back with forced enthusiasm, or leaned in for polite greetings. But none of those touches ever stayed with him. They were business gestures, empty exchanges, habits formed in boardrooms. But this hug, it had no agenda. No hidden motive. Just kindness, pure and simple. As he continued walking, Daniel noticed that his chest felt lighter. There was warmth in him that hadn't been there before. And for a man who was used to carrying weight on his shoulders, that feeling was unusual. He thought to himself, how could something so small matter so much? He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was clear, he had needed that hug more than he realized. It was as if years of loneliness, years of pretending to be fine, had found a brief release in that gentle embrace. He had not cried, but his eyes had almost given way. And even that, he thought, was more emotion than he had shown in a long time. Daniel's car was parked a few blocks away. His driver, who had been waiting patiently, quickly stepped out when he saw him coming. But Daniel raised a hand and said, "It's fine. I'll walk a little longer." The driver, surprised, simply nodded and stepped back. Billionaires didn't usually walk at night, not without security, but Daniel wasn't thinking about protocol. He just wanted to feel the streets, the air, the sounds of people talking, the laughter of children running past. As he walked further, he noticed details he often ignored: a couple sharing a sandwich on a bench, a little boy carrying a balloon, an old man feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs. These small things reminded him of a truth he had forgotten: that life was not always about grand successes and giant numbers. Sometimes, it was about simple moments that carried quiet joy. But even as he observed, the hug replayed in his mind again and again. He could almost still feel it, like an echo on his skin. And every time he remembered it, his chest filled with warmth. It was like a spark in the middle of his darkness. For a man like Daniel, who was so used to controlling every detail of his day, this was new territory. He couldn't control that moment, and maybe that was why it mattered. It had caught him off guard, reminded him that being human was not about control but about connection. When he finally reached his car, he sat in the back seat and leaned his head against the glass window. The city lights blurred as the car moved, but his mind stayed focused on that one sentence: "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" Those words were not just kind, they were brave. Most people would never dare say that to a stranger, let alone someone who carried himself with the air of power Daniel had. But she had seen through the mask. She had seen the sadness behind his eyes. And she had spoken without fear. He thought about that. How rare it was to meet someone who didn't treat him like the billionaire. How rare it was to be noticed as a person, not a symbol of wealth. And that realization shook him. It reminded him of how deeply lonely he had become, even when surrounded by crowds. When Daniel reached home, the mansion was silent as always. Lights turned on automatically as he entered, but there was no voice to greet him, no laughter in the halls. He removed his coat and placed it on the chair, then sat at the dining table. His chef had left a meal for him, carefully prepared, perfectly plated. Yet Daniel stared at it without appetite. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He imagined the hug again, not just the act itself, but the sincerity in it. It was as if that moment had given him permission to feel again. And with that permission came a strange ache in his chest, a longing for something more. He realized how long it had been since he let anyone close. His life had been about numbers, meetings, strategies, and appearances. But who had ever asked him if he was okay? Who had ever looked at him and seen his pain without him saying a word? That stranger had done exactly that. She had spoken with honesty, and for the first time in years, he hadn't brushed it off. He had accepted it. And it had changed something inside him. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. His routine was always strict: meetings, calls, exercise, and schedules filled to the last minute. But today, he found himself staring at his calendar with a sense of emptiness. All those appointments suddenly felt less important. For the first time in a long time, he wondered what would happen if he chose people over profits, connection over business. Throughout the day, his staff noticed he was quieter. He wasn't his usual sharp self in meetings. He listened more, spoke less. His mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the hug that had reminded him of a truth he had long buried. At one point, when his assistant brought him coffee, he smiled genuinely and said, "Thank you." She looked surprised. It wasn't that he had been rude before, but his gratitude always felt automatic, not heartfelt. Today, it carried sincerity. And she noticed. Later, in the middle of a financial discussion, Daniel paused suddenly. He looked around the table at the serious faces of his board members, each of them focused on profits, growth, and competition. For a moment, he wondered if anyone in that room truly felt joy in what they were doing, or if they were all, like him, chasing something that didn't really fill them. He shook his head slightly, pulled back to the conversation, but the thought remained. By the time he returned home that night, Daniel knew something had shifted. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't just ignore the hug, dismiss it as a random event. It had touched something real in him, and he knew he needed more of that: more connection, more humanity, more moments that reminded him of life beyond wealth. As he lay in bed, Daniel whispered to himself, "Maybe this is the beginning of something I didn't even know I needed." He didn't yet understand where this journey would take him. But one thing was clear: a stranger's hug had begun to break the walls he had built around his heart. And for the first time in years, he was ready to let those walls fall, piece by piece. The days following that night were unlike anything Daniel had experienced in years. He continued his routine: meetings, deals, flights, and endless schedules, but something inside him had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about that hug, about the simple kindness of a stranger who had no reason to care, and yet cared anyway. It was as if she had touched a hidden part of his soul, and now that part refused to go back to sleep. Daniel had built his life on discipline and control. Every minute was planned, every step calculated. His team admired him for his sharp mind, but what they didn't know was how heavy it all felt. Now, in the middle of boardroom talks and financial presentations, he would find his mind drifting away. Instead of focusing on profit charts, he would hear that gentle voice in his memory, "I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?" He started to notice things he had long ignored. When his assistant brought him coffee in the morning, he paid attention to the effort she put into remembering how he liked it. When the janitor greeted him with a smile in the hallway, he noticed how genuine it felt compared to the fake smiles he often saw in business dinners. Even in his own company, he began to see people as more than just employees. They were human beings with their own struggles, joys, and stories. One afternoon, Daniel walked into a meeting where his managers were discussing ways to cut costs. The conversation was tense, voices raised, numbers thrown around like weapons. Normally, Daniel would have joined in with his sharp tone, pushing for results. But this time, he stayed quiet for a while, simply observing. He noticed how nervous some of his younger managers looked, afraid of saying the wrong thing. He noticed how one of them, a woman named Clara, seemed exhausted, her eyes heavy as though she hadn't slept well in days. Suddenly, Daniel interrupted. "Clara," he said gently, "are you all right?" The room fell silent. No one had ever heard him ask a question like that in the middle of a financial meeting. Clara looked startled, unsure how to respond. I'm fine, sir," she stammered. But Daniel didn't let it go. "You don't look fine. If there's something you need: rest, support, help, say it. Work is important, but so are you." The entire room shifted. For the first time, Daniel wasn't speaking like the billionaire boss. He was speaking like a human being. Clara's eyes watered, though she tried to hide it, and she whispered, "Thank you." That small moment reminded Daniel of something he had nearly forgotten, that leadership wasn't only about profit, but also about people. And just like that stranger's hug had lifted him, he could also lift others with kindness. At home, his reflection deepened. His mansion, with its grand halls and shining floors, now looked emptier than ever. He realized that all his wealth had built him a castle, but also a prison. What good were chandeliers and expensive art if there was no one to share them with? One evening, he sat by the window in his study, sipping tea. His mind went back to his childhood once more, the way his mother hugged him after he scraped his knee, the way his father would smile proudly even at his smallest achievements. Those memories were treasures that no amount of money could replace. And yet, somewhere along the way, he had traded them for numbers in a bank account. The more he thought, the clearer it became, he didn't want to keep living like this. Something had to change. The next day, Daniel called a meeting with his closest team. They expected another round of strategies and high-pressure discussions, but instead, he surprised them. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what we're building here. And I realized something: we talk too much about money, and too little about meaning. We focus on profits, but forget about people. I want to change that." The team looked confused. Some even whispered to each other, wondering if he was serious. But Daniel's eyes were calm, steady, and unlike the cold determination they were used to seeing. This was different. From that day, Daniel began making small but powerful changes. He created programs to support employees' well-being, offered flexible hours for those with families, and encouraged open conversations about stress. He visited departments he hadn't stepped into in years, talking to workers personally, asking about their lives. And to everyone's shock, he listened, really listened. Some thought it was a strategy, another clever move to build loyalty. But those who looked closer realized it was genuine. The billionaire had changed. Outside of work, Daniel also began reconnecting with people he had long ignored. He called his sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in months, and spent an hour listening to her stories instead of rushing her off the phone. He visited an old friend from college, not to talk business, but simply to share memories. And each time, he felt that same warmth he had felt during that hug, a reminder that connection was the real treasure of life. Of course, not everyone understood. Some of his business partners worried he was becoming soft. They whispered that he was losing his edge. But Daniel no longer cared about appearing untouchable. For the first time, he cared more about being real than being perfect. At night, as he walked through the city again, he found himself hoping he might see that woman once more, the one who had given him the hug that started it all. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how much her kindness had changed him. But even if he never saw her again, he knew the lesson would stay with him forever. Because in that one simple gesture, she had reminded him of a truth he had buried beneath wealth and power, that every human heart, no matter how rich or poor, needs love, needs kindness, needs connection. And for Daniel, that realization was not just healing, it was transforming. He wasn't the same man anymore. He wasn't just a billionaire chasing endless numbers. He was a man learning to live again, learning to feel again, learning that the greatest wealth of all was found not in gold or stocks, but in the quiet warmth of a moment shared between two hearts. As he sat in his office late one evening, the city lights glowing outside, he whispered to himself with a small smile, "That hug, it saved me in ways I didn't even know I needed." Months had passed since that evening when Daniel received the unexpected hug from a stranger. Yet the memory of that moment was still as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He often thought about it, not because it was unusual, but because it was powerful. It was a reminder that even the strongest, wealthiest people needed something as simple as kindness. By now, Daniel had changed in ways that even he found surprising. His employees noticed a softer tone in his meetings, his family noticed a warmer presence in his calls, and even his driver, who had worked for him for years, noticed that Daniel now asked questions like, "How's your family?" or "Are you doing all right?" These were words he had never thought to ask before. But the biggest change was inside him. The loneliness that once followed him everywhere was still there sometimes, but it no longer felt like a prison. He had allowed cracks to form in the walls he had built around his heart. And through those cracks, light was coming in. One day, he was invited to speak at a charity event. Normally, Daniel would give the usual polished speech about growth, strategy, and the importance of hard work. But this time, as he stood on stage, he felt something different stirring inside him. The audience was filled with business leaders, journalists, students, and ordinary people curious to hear from a billionaire. They expected numbers and advice. Instead, they got a story. He began slowly, his voice calm. "I want to share something personal with you tonight. Something that changed me more than any business deal or financial success ever could." The room grew quiet. He continued, "A few months ago, I was walking through this very city, late at night, after a long and difficult day. I was tired. I was weighed down. And though I may look like a man who has everything, the truth is, I was feeling empty inside." People shifted in their seats, curious. Then, Daniel said softly, "Something happened. A stranger looked at me, saw my face, and simply said, 'I think you need a hug. Can I hug you?'" A ripple went through the room. Some smiled, some looked surprised, and others leaned forward to hear more. "I cannot explain it fully," Daniel admitted, "but in that moment, I felt something I had forgotten. I felt seen. I felt human. That hug was not about money, not about business, not about image. It was about kindness. And it reminded me that no matter who we are, no matter how much we achieve, we all need connection. We all need love. We all need to remember that behind every face is a human heart." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. Daniel smiled gently. "That small act of kindness changed the way I see life. It taught me that true wealth is not what sits in a bank account. True wealth is when we care for one another. When we take time to notice someone else's pain. When we offer something as simple as a smile, a word of encouragement, or maybe even a hug." By the time he finished, the audience erupted into applause. Not the usual polite clapping he was used to, but a heartfelt, powerful applause that filled the hall. Some even stood, moved by his honesty. The next morning, his story was everywhere: headlines, social media, television. People didn't focus on his billions. They focused on the hug. They called it the hug that changed a billionaire. And soon, others began sharing their own stories of kindness. People hugged strangers, helped neighbors, reached out to friends they hadn't spoken to in years. Daniel didn't expect any of this. He hadn't told the story for attention. He had told it because it was real. But now, seeing the ripple effect, he realized something even greater. One act of kindness had multiplied, spreading from one person to another, touching countless lives. And as for Daniel, he kept living differently. He no longer rushed through life as if success was the only destination. He slowed down, he listened, he connected. He built deeper relationships with his family, he invested in causes that supported people, and he made time to simply enjoy life outside the walls of business. Yet deep down, he often wondered about that stranger. Who was she? Did she know what she had done for him? Did she have any idea that her simple question had sparked a change in a man who seemed untouchable? One evening, months later, Daniel was walking again through the city, just as he had that night. The streets were busy, filled with chatter and the smell of food carts. And then, in the distance, he saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the park. It was her. He stopped for a moment, his heart beating a little faster. Should he approach? Would she even remember him? After all, to her, it might have just been a small act, something she had forgotten. But to him, it was life-changing. Gathering his courage, Daniel walked toward her. She looked up, and her face lit with recognition. "You," she said softly, smiling. Daniel nodded, almost laughing at how simple yet powerful this moment felt. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, but filled with understanding. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if you realize what you did for me that night. But I want you to know, you changed my life." The woman tilted her head, still smiling gently. "I didn't do much. I just gave you what you needed in that moment." Daniel shook his head. "You did more than you know. You reminded me of something I had forgotten. And because of you, I see life differently now." The woman's eyes softened. "Sometimes, it doesn't take much to remind someone they're human. I'm glad you let me." They talked for a while, two people sitting on a bench in the middle of a busy city. One was a billionaire, the other an ordinary stranger. But in that moment, they were simply two human beings sharing a connection. As Daniel stood to leave, he smiled warmly. "Thank you again. For that hug. For reminding me what matters." The woman nodded. "Don't thank me. Just pass it on. That's how kindness works." And Daniel did. For the rest of his life, he carried that lesson with him. Every time he showed kindness, every time he listened instead of rushing, every time he offered comfort to someone in need, he was passing it on. Because sometimes, the greatest changes in life don't come from grand speeches, big deals, or huge achievements. Sometimes, they come from the simplest acts: a kind word, a gentle smile, or a hug offered at just the right time. And so, the billionaire who once thought he had everything discovered that the greatest treasure was something he had overlooked all along: the warmth of human connection.